Great. Thank you very much for showing up for the East-West webinar today, specifically on the China challenges, analyzing Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Mexico as manufacturing and supply chain alternatives. We've got a great presentation today. We are very fortunate to have three very seasoned global executives on the call today. We've got to have a couple of housekeeping things I want to address right up front. We encourage everyone to ask questions, to sign up and ask questions during this process. On the control panel is on your right. If you see the orange arrow and it's pointing to the left, it's collapsed. You'll press it so the control panel expands out. Follow that, open up the webinar control panel, and you'll see a tab to ask questions. Go ahead and ask the questions, and then it'll come to us, and we'll be able to get those questions in. We've got a very large number of companies who are on the webinar today. We will try to get to all the questions that we can. If we cannot get to your question, you'll hear back from us in approximately 3 business days with either an answer to that question, or you'll get a brief call for us to better understand what your question is. We have on the webinar today, we're going to briefly cover a few things. We're going to have a brief introduction of East-West, and then an introduction to the corporate speakers, and about currently what's going on, the current economic challenges in China. That'll be a short period. Then we'll discuss, briefly cover EWA's methodology for addressing global manufacturing supply chain strategy. A lot of companies are right now, most of the companies who signed up on the various webinars and as part of this discussion, most of them have facilities on the ground in China, and they are actively looking to, diversify their manufacturing supply chain in other parts of the world, specifically Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Mexico. And so we'll briefly go down that methodology of how we're doing it, and we'll lay out 3 very short case studies that showing how companies have successfully done that. At that point, we're then turning to introduction on the speakers, and that is going to be about 40 to 45 minutes of this webinar. It's going to be asking questions from 3 very seasoned executives who know what they're talking about, and I think we'll certainly benefit from that. So I'll get ready to move forward. We've got a lot of questions, so go ahead and get started, get moving on this. We'll finish right at 1 hour. So at this point, let me move forward and just briefly introduce East-West Associates. For those who don't know us, East-West is a provider of corporate strategy, commercial, operational, risk management. The people who work at East-West have one qualification, and that is they've all had P&L responsibilities for running a Western multinational on the ground in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, and the U.S. So they had P&L responsibilities for running that company, running manufacturing, running the supply chain. They all came up in different functional skill sets, but they've run companies on the ground in those 4 regions. So they had ultimate responsibility to the company. You can see some of the titles down there that we put where our executives come from: Briggs & Stratton, Littelfuse. You see titles kind of broad breadth there from Mexico, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the U.S. Here are the 5 regions where we operate. And we'll now turn it over. I want to talk to the corporate speakers and ask them to give a background on themselves, if they would. Dave, why don't you start us off, if you don't mind?
Great. Thanks, Alex. And hi, everyone. I'm Dave Burdick, and I'm president of a division of JBT Corporation called JBT Aerotech. We manufacture specialty vehicles, primarily for airports, and that includes things like cargo loaders, pushback tractors, de-icer trucks, and the Jetway brand passenger boarding bridges that you all walk through before you get on a plane. And been in that role for about 9 years. Prior to that, I have 8 years in the construction equipment manufacturing business, and prior to that, about 15 years in the office furniture business. So I've been involved with manufacturing supply chain going back 30 years from China and Mexico, more recently Eastern Europe, whether it's including company-owned manufacturing plants as well as contract manufacturers, joint ventures, and external suppliers.
That's great, Dave. Thank you very much. It's good history. Andy, if you would mind doing the same thing, please.
My name is Andy Barnauskas, actually Chief Operating Officer and Senior VP at Banner. And I've been around the block at Banner for way too long, 32 years. I appreciate the term seasoned, by the way. That means we're all old. So
Nope.
Banner's been an international company for decades, and we started our China operation we started the project in 2001, opened our factory in 2003, still operating with the same management staff, so we're very proud of that facility. And then at the same time established a global supply chain, obviously including China, Southeast Asia, not so much yet in Eastern Europe, but North America, we have a very large supply base here as well. And as we'll be talking about today, there are definitely challenges in the world, and as a global company, there seems to be things we're talking about more regionalized type manufacturing supply chain, so we'll get into that game here. But my background is I'm an old IT guy, actually, then got bored with IT, got into the operations world, helped run our supply chain for a while, got our manufacturing up and running in multiple countries. So I'm very seasoned, let's put it that way.
All right. Mark, why don't if you would
Sure.
follow.
Yeah, thanks. I might be the most seasoned. I might be the most seasoned of the group, but anyway, yeah, I'm Mark Plum. Thanks, Alex. So I've been with Alex in East West Associates since I came back from China in 2015. Prior to that, I pretty much spent my whole career living and working in Asia. I started out with American Standard Train Air Conditioning in Thailand and ran their Indochina operation for 5-6 years, then moved up to China in 2000 and I guess not, pardon me, 1997, and pretty much in China until 2014. First was with, again, Train, American Standard, setting up operations and building, and then moved over and became president of Briggs and Stratton for Asia, based out of Shanghai, where we had 6 to 8 manufacturing facilities from Osaka, Japan, down to Ho Chi Minh City, and ran a fairly large organization for many years, again since 2002. So I'm been in Asia a long time, then back here, but prior to that, I had done a lot of work with General Electric in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and of course Mexico. So that's sort of my background.
All right. So like we promised, 3 very smart executives who are here to answer questions. So we'll jump right into this. Mark, if you would kind of take us briefly on just looking at the economic situation in China, where it's been.
Sure. So I'll take us down memory lane here for just a second. So, a lot of us 20, 25, 30 years ago, we went to China, and we went to China really for 2 reasons. We were looking for inexpensive labor, and we were looking and chasing maybe a pot of gold, which was a large domestic market, or both. And a lot of us, and I was involved in several organizations where we sold domestically, and of course we exported because we had great labor rates. But then what happened about 15 years ago or so, what happened? Well, the labor costs began to really start to rise. And then after that, we had a little bit more problems with regulatory issues in China. It wasn't quite as easy to set things up. Then what happened, which is really interesting, is our partners and our contract manufacturers and some of our own employees became our competition, and they started competing against us with like products. And then 10 years ago, Xi Jinping came in his first 5-year program and initiated kind of China 2025 buy initiative. And what's really critical about this, we all know, he's just taken on his 3rd term in the 5th Party Congress, and his main theme is self-sufficiency. If you read through some of his speeches and things at the 5th Party Congress, it's self-sufficiency, meaning let China handle China, and we don't need the rest of the world in some cases. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. And then, of course, what happened? We had the 2017 tariffs, and that for those of us that were bringing stuff back in from China to the USA, 20-25% duties was problematic, of course. And then COVID hit, and COVID hurts 2 ways. One, it really restricts us traveling there to oversee our businesses, and it just cripples our supply chains by shutting down our tier 1, our tier 2, our tier 3 suppliers. I mean, just really quickly yesterday, as we know, in Zhengzhou, Foxconn has got a 200,000 person facility locked down. It's really problematic. And then, of course, all that combined then to restrictions, port closures, lack of containers, and containers got up to the West Coast up to 25,000, 30,000. They're coming back down now. So short of the story is, reason we all went to China, a lot of us went to China 20, 25 years ago. A lot of those really good attributes are no longer there.
Right.
Slide up, please, Alex.
Now what we're going to do is look at the briefly global supply chain manufacturing methodology of East-West. That just lays the groundwork for the discussion on the webinars, but particularly on the discussion. So Mark, if you would kind of briefly take us through that.
Yeah, sure. No problem. We'll talk a little bit. See, all this is kind of based on what I just mentioned regarding China and what's changed in China. And we at East-West, we have a 3-step process. And what we do, and what one of our core competencies is to assist in developing China +1 strategies or China improvement strategies, or both. In other words, a lot of people are in China and they're there for a reason. They want to stay. We help improve it. Or they're in China, but they want to maybe mitigate their footprint to a certain degree, and then we assist them. So our 3-step process really starts with what we call step 1, and that's us, East-West, working with your headquarters staff. Really understanding your location of your key markets and customers. Critical, and you'll see how that carries through in the case studies. We also have to really understand your operating model. I mean, are you vertically integrated? Do you do a lot of sourcing, contract manufacturing? What's your scale, your business and operations? Are you big enough to expand where you want to go with an existing footprint, or do you have to maybe look at a larger footprint? What's your reliance on suppliers such as raw materials, parts? Do you contract manufacture? Again, how vertically integrated are you? Again, current projected manufacturing and supply chain capacity. Do you have the clout right now with your organization to expand where you want to go, or do you have to add to that? And then, of course, what's your exposure for tariffs and other political issues, that sort of thing. And then lastly, your financial priorities and things, and how do you want to go? So this is designed at the headquarters to really understand your current state. Next slide, please, Alex. Continuing with current state, then we go out in the field and we review your commercial, technical, and operational information with field interviews, meaning we go to your factories. We understand your manufacturing footprint. We understand your supply chain network, and we even go visit a couple of your tier 1 suppliers. We understand your production and your production scale, your product and your product scale, because can you expand where you want to go given your footprint? How's your inventories, key components, finished goods? That all adds up to what's your landed cost basis for your key products. And then based on that, how does the impact of tariffs and logistics costs? And then, of course, your labor costs, your head count, and your projected wage inflation, is we have to understand that. And then, of course, as important as your labor costs is really your availability and stability of your direct and indirect labor. So step 1 and step 2, or pardon me, step 1A and step 1B is really gets you to current state. And it's really and what that tells us is where are your customers and how do you support them currently? Then we go into what we call future goals. We talk with you and we work. Where do you want to go as it turns to a supply chain, product, your landed cost targets, capacity requirements, things you have to consider while you're deciding where you want to go is what's your manufacturing capabilities and capacity? Can you go where you want to go with existing footprint? Is your model going to work on a larger scale, outsourcing / contract manufacturing spend? How much are you spending there? And then really we build up then a landed cost, materials, factory costs, freight, tariffs, inventory, customer delivery performance. All of that feeds into where do you want to go? And then we have to decide, okay, where is it you want to go? And what's some of the things you're looking at? No, would you go back, please, Alex? Do you want to reduce your landed costs? Do you want to reduce your inventories? Do you want to be closer to your growth markets? Do you want to reduce sole sourcing? Do you want to mitigate some of your reliance on one country or one supplier? Do you want to avoid tariffs, or all above, or some of the above? So at this point, we know where you are. We know where you want to go. So then, next slide, please, Alex. For those of you who have been around, the old business terminology, we really end up then what we call gap analysis. Again, where are you now? Where do you want to go? How do I get there? And what issues do I have to overcome? So for example, we have to identify the required changes to your current state. So what we have to do is assess your current and future competitiveness of your existing footprint, your existing operations and suppliers. Can you get where you want to go with your existing footprint? You need to also then identify the actions to improve cost and cash flow performance. Say that you're in China and you're struggling some in China now because of the things we mentioned on slide 3 or 4. How do we improve your situation in China with cash flow and performance? Now, let's say you can't get there, or you still want to mitigate your footprint in China because of whatever reason. Then we assist then with exploring what does a change in geography do for you. So so that tells us, so now what do we know? We know where you are, we know where you want to go, we know what are some of the issues to get there, and then we put together, based on this analysis, our recommendations. Do you improve your existing operation? Can you improve your existing operation? Do you want to broaden your footprint? And if you do want to broaden your footprint, where do you go, and how do you do it, and how do you get there? So that kind of takes us through our our methodology on assisting clients that are in China and they either want to improve in China or they want to mitigate and move out of China. So then Alex, we'll move on to the case studies. Case studies are pretty interesting.
Mark, let me just say one thing. I noticed we just had a bunch of people sign up. They're running a couple minutes late. Again, the quick housekeeping, we encourage questions throughout this whole time. We've already got some earlier, and we got some on the webinar. For those who just signed up, go to your control panel and you'll see a tab for questions, and please feel free to ask questions on that and we'll get it and we'll ask them. If we can't get to it, we'll get back to you in the next 3 business days. All right, Mark, please.
Yeah, sure. So, and we're going to go through 3 case studies. I'm going to talk about the first 2, and Alex will talk about the last one. And I mentioned it when we went back to current state. The overarching questions we have to ask ourselves. You have to ask yourselves are, where are your customers today, and where do you think your customers are going to be in the future? Because that's really going to drive your manufacturing and sourcing footprint. And it sounds kind of basic, but it's something that a lot of times people don't really sit down and work themselves through. So the first case study is a fairly large company, very, very strong in their individual business, 1.8 billion in the automotive parts and supply. They have a factory in China. We have USA, Europe, and China. But their factory in China has reached capacity. They're surrounded because of growth around them, and that's pretty typical when they're in the Guangdong province, which is really growing up around them. Their customer base is 30% in China, but has grown outside of China. It's now 70% in Southeast Asia. So they had made a decision. They wanted to minimize the China footprint, and they wanted to take advantage of Southeast Asia, as that's where their future customers they felt were going to be. So deliverables from East West is, of course, we conducted a site selection study, and we agreed on Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. We recommended Vietnam based on a variety of things, but there was availability of greenfield sites that they were interested in. They also had some existing lease buildings. As I said, they had skilled labor. This was really a kind of a metal manufacturing type of automotive supplier. So we had supply chain vendors. We had potential tax incentives because what they were doing was attractive to the Vietnamese. And then so anyway, we recommended and the board approved it for the new facility. Then our next step was they decided they wanted to build their own facility, own it, versus having a build to suit and lease back. So we searched for multiple greenfield sites. We narrowed it to 3 locations. Then, of course, we negotiated with the Vietnamese and kind of played one against the other for some tax benefits. Again, we presented to senior execs with the board of directors, and it was approved. So then what happened is because they wanted to not lease, not have a build to suit and lease back, but to own the facility, own the land. Oh, but land's leased for 90 years. So they wanted to build it. We were engaged in to oversee the general contractor. We put our own project manager in, identified and qualified Vietnamese suppliers. It took us 18 months, actually about 20 months from the time we had a go on Vietnam to when we cut the ribbon on the facility, and the plant continues to perform quite well. So again, the reason that one was interesting is the products they were producing in China were staying in Asia. So Southeast Asia became our target of where we wanted to go. Alex, can you go to case 2? Thanks. This one again is a one. This is, you got to go back, Alex, to case 2.
Excuse me.
Here we go. So this is a $1 billion chemical manufacturer. Again, he's in China, USA. Again, because in China, their business was, and it was kind of interesting. They went to China originally 25 years ago, chasing inexpensive labor. And a big part of what they were doing in China at that then was to ship their products to Europe. Their markets for that particular product was Germany, Italy, UK, Spain, and France. So they were able then to ship them, from China to Western Europe, and the freight cost and the time on the water was compensated or overcome because it was so inexpensive when they first went there. They reduced their costs from when they went there from the States to close to 35–40%. But then they just, now what's happened because of all the things in China, that cost structure has gone away. So they came to us and said, we need to get closer to our European customers, particularly Germany, France, and Italy. So again, they hired us to do a site selection. We conducted the study, and we shortlisted Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And then we narrowed it down to 3 sites in Poland and the Czech Republic. And we recommended a site in the Czech Republic along the Silesian Moravian region, which if you know where that is, it's right along the border. And in the city of Ostrava, or close to Ostrava, is where we recommended. We negotiated tax incentives with the Czech officials. We identified suppliers and contractors. The operation was completed, and we also, again, contractors as well as developers. In this case, it was a build to suit and lease back, where they wanted to do that, and we shortlisted those suppliers. And then of course we were able to reduce the size of the footprint of the China operation. And then of course the Czech plant now operates very efficiently. And for example, now they can ship from just west of Ostrava to Berlin in 6 hours on 4-lane highways. So it's really shortened their supply chain. Okay, Alex, you got, I think,
great. Study. This is the final case study. That just gives you an example. This is on Mexico. This was an interesting scenario. It's a food and beverage manufacturer. They had plants in the U.S. and supply chain in the U.S. as well as in China. Their struggle, though, was that the operations in the U.S. were too expensive to maintain and remain competitive. The operations were located in the Northeast, pretty high cost area. So they knew they needed to look elsewhere, but the primary market is the U.S. So they asked us to do a site selection financial evaluation for them getting into Mexico. So at that point, we stopped. We knew the customer base in the U.S. They couldn't rely on the U.S. manufacturing as it got so expensive. So we did the site selection search in Mexico. We established criteria to get the plan, found availability of labor, available sites. We started identifying and qualifying some Mexican vendors that could work with this company. At that point, we made the recommendation to the board. Board came back and said, yes, we like what we've got. Please move forward. So we now went out and qualified with several supplier audits, got the RFQs to the Mexican suppliers now, and then we've gone out and shortlisted 3 potential build-to-suit developers and have made them a final recommendation. So that's where it lays with that beverage company. But again, that was the whole point, was they were in the U.S. It wasn't the right location, but their market was the U.S. So they needed to stay in this area. Mexico was the ideal selection. All right, so now the rest of this is going into the Q&A session. So we have questions that have already started popping up. So let me kind of go into the questions. And this is the core point of the webinar, is to take advantage of 3 smart people. So while I'll start with the first question was, as we've talked above, the China model for manufacturing, manufacturing for supply chain has changed as operating in China has got more difficult, it's got more expensive. Obviously, companies are trying to move closer. There's customer base, develop more regional supply chains. Since you all have all operated globally, first question is, can you share how you're seeing this diversification out of China? In your own thoughts and your own conversations you have with other executives, are you seeing this diversification out of China? Do you think it will continue? And do you see other companies, manufacturing companies, having the same scenario, same issues? Dave, why don't we start with you if you got some thoughts on that?
Sure. I'll start with a disclaimer that my comments don't necessarily reflect my own company's strategies, but more of a broader sense. And I am part of the Manufacturers Alliance. We recently had a meeting and we went and did a roundtable with a lot of input on specifically on China. And for the first time in the last 30 years, virtually no one is investing in growth or capital equipment, factories, et cetera, in China right now. And those that are selling in China are not downside. They know at this point, if you want to sell in China, you just about have to manufacture in China. So that's a given. But for those that were manufacturing in China primarily for export, I would say risk mitigation is the number one issue. Yeah, the labor costs are higher in China. There's other issues, but the biggest thing that's happened in the last few years with COVID lockdowns and the whole supply chain problems and now political concerns is the risk mitigation. And folks are, if they're staying in Asia, they're going to other Southeast Asia countries for expansions. And otherwise they're moving to what we call regional best cost country manufacturing, which would be Mexico for the North American market. It would be Czech Republic, Poland for the European market.
Yeah.
I guess I'll back up those comments because that's exactly what I've been hearing as well. Same thing, disclaimer about company strategies versus general comments here. The other major change that is from simply a supply chain standpoint is the landed cost model has completely changed in the last 3 years. And a lot of people don't see that going back. So what was really a simple decision before going, okay, we can land this thing back in the US or other markets out of China, that math has changed and it's changed forever. The other comment I would make is that, labor cost, everybody's always concerned about labor cost, but it seems like there's really the end of low cost labor. It's all relative now. So it really depends on the cost structure of your product and how that plays. For a lot of companies, the cost structure of labor is probably the lowest component compared to other, materials is probably higher. So supply chain is probably a bigger risk factor there. I will say that risk in many different forms is becoming a very high priority versus cost or anything else. Geopolitical risk, supply chain risk, customer service risk, lead time risk, all that stuff is definitely in the minds of just about everybody.
Andy, let me ask you a follow-up question. Go to you first. We've heard some reports recently after the recent Party Congress that the Chinese officials are looking at potentially loosening some of the travel restrictions, right, and allowing more Western travel into China. Do you think that changes all the scenario we are talking about here today?
I would say, Alex, you first. You go first. The answer is no. We really don't see that changing. I mean, just the story we talked about this morning with what's happening in Guangzhou.
Yeah.
They have 4 million of 20 million people locked down right now. We have daily talks with our contacts in China. It's all over the country. We just don't see a way out. Many people don't see a way out with what's happening over there unless they do open up, but it's not anytime soon. So we are not traveling over there now.
Yeah, Dave,
I
you
think-
see the same thing?
Yes, I think travel will definitely gradually open up, but I don't see the trend changing. I think everybody that's gone through the last 3 years has realized they need to mitigate their risk, and most folks that I talk to are doing just that. And that's not a short-term issue. I think this is a long-term structural change that's happening.
Yes.
Mark, would you
I-
agree with that?
You saw in 2016.
Yeah, this is, and we,
The
yeah,
tariffs
just
were.
kind of,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
I was
Finish your
going to
thought.
say 2016.
go ahead, Andy,
Obviously,
please.
administration in power, but the tariffs started. Those tariffs have not gone away, have they? Doesn't matter what administration's in. So the
No.
message that was very clear to many people at that time was, oh, this is a long-term game. This is not a short-term play. It was much higher than it was a bigger game than just the tariffs. Put it that way.
Right. Yeah, all I was going to say is it's to reiterate what Dave and Andy are saying is it's so much is out of your control, and it's a little bit like we always use the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and freight, and then the cost went up, and then Xi Jinping, and then China 2025. But COVID has really, this one seems to be I wouldn't say the final straw, but it is just, and because you can't go there, but more importantly though, you can't get stuff out of there because your suppliers can't even get to your factories because they get locked down, right? And then that drove the freight rate. So you're so much of what you like to control, you can't control. And that for a business manager is really upsetting.
Yeah, all the point I would make is on the COVID side, I agree. We're shutting down 3 factories right now in the Suzhou area. And how we do that and how we shut those down and make notification to all the employees is dramatically changed, right? Because you can't go to hotels because if you have a case there, then the hotel's got liability, and then you as a company are paying for all your employees to go to 10-day quarantine, and that gets pretty expensive. So it's significantly changed the way the business is. So we got a question in here. The final question on that was around the supply chain piece, and we got talk about here. The question was, the key issues when you look at Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Mexico. This company doesn't identify what industry sector in, but they want to talk about on the supply chain. This company has got 2 factories in China. They're in the electronic space, and they're looking to get into new regions, specifically for supply chain. I know that as we've talked before, you've got the electronic sectors in Vietnam, electronic sectors in Thailand, electronic sectors in Mexico. Not so much in Eastern Europe, although depending, maybe it's more automotive related. But how do you all go about when you're moving to a new area of trying to find suppliers, qualify the suppliers, and to make sure that risk, Andy, your point about risk management, how that risk is managed?
You want to go first, Dave, or you want me to go?
Go ahead, Andy, you go first this time.
Well, there's really no easy answer for that one. Having people on the ground, whether they're your own employees or a company like East West or some of the other people in line, is really I'll call it a key component in trying to find local supply chain, because you just can't do it through searches. You can't do it through virtual things. People have to be on the ground to find it, and every commodity is a little different. If you're really trying to find electronics, you have to be talking to the manufacturers, not the people you buy it from, because they're the ones who hold all the keys, and you need to understand how their supply chain works in order to kind of manage that whole thing. So we have lots of conversations internally here and talking to other people about talking to the electronics manufacturing people, understanding where their supply chain struggles are, and then talking with local either distributors in country or buying direct or things like that. So it really, again, depends on where you're going and what you're trying to buy. I mean, that's a pretty general question, but it's pretty universal.
Yeah, and one caveat here is that depending on what it is, a lot of the supply chain is still going to be coming out of China. If it's semiconductors, you can just expect that most of those are going to come out of China, sensors, LEDs, whatever, certain raw materials. So that's a big factor to consider. You know, Vietnam is very close to Guangdong province, so there's excellent supply chain from China there. But it's the farther away you get, the more of an issue that might become. I like Andy's comment. I second that. You know, if you're looking at it mostly an assembly type operation, go back to the first, second tier supply, the key suppliers, and to make sure that you know, what does logistics look like? Because as you said earlier, labor cost is probably not the biggest component of cost. And so the cost of the material, landed cost of material, including the logistics, is probably the biggest single thing to make sure you have your arms around.
Yeah, the other thing I would mention is no matter what area you're going into from a supply chain, make sure there's a backup. Because I think this audience all knows that China really owns the raw printed circuit board market for the electronic manufacturers out there for the basic raw board type things. But you need to have a backup with that in mind, because you're going to get the best cost, landed cost out of China for that type of commodity. But it's important to have alternatives.
You're right. This is Vietnam has really gotten, you know, they haven't come up the technology curve so far yet, but as far up from an assembly operation, and as you mentioned, outside of Hanoi, Andy and Dave, and they're shipping in from Guangdong, and you know, a 12-hour truck drive down there. So they're able to apply some very inexpensive labor with the components coming out of China, which is really a pretty good model. And then we can't forget Thailand, of course, on consumer electronics and PCB boards. They were, as we always talk about, China was doing all this stuff. Pardon me, Thailand was doing all this stuff before China was. Then it all got sucked out of Thailand because of labor. Mexico as well, right? I mean, they both got everything sucked out. But as it begins to filter back now because of the higher costs in China, countries like Thailand begin to be look a little more attractive. Plus, you know, you have treaties. You know, you have the treaty between Thailand and USA, which keeps you from having arbitrary duties tossed on you. The Treaty of Amity and that kind of stuff. So, but and then of course that gets you around some of the duties. So you have to really dig deep to decide, you know, how you go about doing it.
We just had a question pop up about, do any of you all feel like the tariffs are going to be repealed in the next 3 years? I know it's a very subjective question.
Tariffs with China? No.
Yes, tariffs with China.
This is probably the biggest bipartisan thing in Washington that both parties agree with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There probably be exceptions for certain really good lobbying groups in the United States, which there are a few, but for the general, I would say no, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah. I agree with what the guys are saying. If they would have changed it, it would have been changed already, because the stuff they wanted to change was done pretty quickly.
Correct.
Yeah.
The next question came up was, can you all talk a little bit about labor rates as kind of they compare with China versus other parts of Southeast Asia? What does that look like, or within Eastern Europe? And I know, Mark, you've got some thoughts on that. Maybe you be the right person to start.
I'll take a stab at it. Well, we got to be careful, and the guys already talked about it. Labor rates may not be as important as other things based on, you know, the sophistication of the product and the supply chain. However, Vietnam, I mean, that's why I mentioned, you know, outside of Ho Chi Minh City and Haiphong area, with lower labor rates for assembly, they can then bring the stuff in from Guangdong. So we believe the labor rates in Vietnam and those industrial areas are 30-40% of what China is. And in Thailand, where, you know, again, it depends on the product, of course, is about 50-60% of what China is. So depending on your sophistication of your product and your labor required, it'll, you can, but I'm not so sure, and I'm not saying we're chasing cheap labor, but as Andy said, there may not be any more cheap labor to chase. So you have to look at the whole product mix and your whole bill of material, right?
Yeah, I guess the other factor that has hit home the last year and a half here is the inflation rates as well, right?
Mm.
You really got to do your 3 to 5 year projection on what that's really going to be in the long term versus just what it is now. And I don't know. Everybody probably has their own opinion on where inflation's going, but it seems like it's not going to settle. It'll settle, but it's still going to be there.
Yeah.
So similarly, I'd say if you go to Poland, you're probably looking at about 30% of the cost versus compared to Germany, France. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah,
that's what
yeah.
I would say. And
Oh, yes.
Czech Republic would be slightly higher than Poland, but not dramatically, maybe 10% higher, something like that.
Yeah, no, and then if you get even Eastern Czech, on that Slavian rate, you can get pretty close. But the real value is your access to your markets. I said 10 hours on freeways to get to Berlin from there. So, pretty, so again, kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's kind of where your customers are is going to drive so much of your strategy. And it sounds so basic, but we find sometimes that people they kind of lose track of that. Basing trying to chase cheap labor and then throw it on a boat somewhere. Well, those days are over.
Right. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's a key thing is to understand what the strategy is for why you're going to a certain place.
Yeah.
For the market, well, then it's a different set of priorities than it is if it's just chasing the low cost dollar.
Yeah. Right.
Now, one thing, speaking of logistics, ocean freight spiked earlier this year. It just went through the roof, like 400%. And that's come back down, not quite all the way, but almost all the way. And I mean, it may spike again, like oil prices, but it was not sustainable at those higher rates. They were opportunistic rates. People took advantage of it. I think the ocean freight is going to come back down to more normalized level, my opinion.
It's happening, I think, now, as you said, Dave, right? Yeah.
I guess it's coming back down, but I'm not sure it's going to go back to where it was before, because they're going to. Right. Companies are getting smarter, both in airline and in ocean. They're going to take capacity out.
Yeah.
Keep the rates up.
I mean, when I was there, those $2,500, $3,000 containers from Guangdong to Long Beach, that was, your cost per unit, depending on whatever your load was, whatever your shipping wasn't prohibitive. Yeah.
Well, that was actually the one of the questions we just got in was about the cost of moderating. Do you all see going back to pre-COVID levels, or do you think it'll still remain high? Sounds like
I was just looking at commodity prices right before here, like copper. It's like, oh, copper's coming down, but if you look at the 5-year trend, it's way up from what it was 5 years ago. So will it come down to those levels? Maybe if we go into a really deep recession, but I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah. So the question popped up, I guess, is related to the electrical side. This is a company, it's an electronics firm, and they're saying that one of the struggles they're having is finding alternate sources beyond China for kind of basic products like wire and electrical components, like hardware and nuts and bolts, circuit breakers. And so the question is, do you look at Southeast Asia for that? Do you look at Mexico? Do you have to do a blend of the two, or are there other locations that may be able to assist them? And I don't know if anyone has that's a kind of a more specific question.
Is yes to all of those.
Yeah. But that's very true. China's got the majority of the supply chain on those, so it takes a lot of work to try to find alternatives. And oftentimes you aren't going to get as good a price as China, but what you will get is risk mitigation backup.
Yeah, again, I'll go back to every company's got to figure out for their own strategies what your landed cost model is.
Yeah.
That's going to be the key driver because everybody's landed cost model is going to be different.
That's right.
And, you know, and it changes. And we've been working on that. We keep working on it going as things change.
Well, you know, that's exactly right. In because you look, there's so many different products where China really has complete domination, or has a significant role in that. Even if it's minerals or if there's certain products, they've built out such a good system. People are awfully dependent on it, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to last, I think, for quite a long time with some of these market sectors where they're in.
One other comment about the landed cost model. Again, this personal experience here is it's important that as many people in your company understands it, because everybody's going to be looking at landed cost model differently and making different decisions on it. So you should be unified in that regard. And I don't think anybody's perfect. That's all I'll say.
When you're talking about landed cost model, you're talking about as far as companies looking at this, as far as their own risk management situation, what are the plan Bs that they've got out there?
Right.
So,
Yeah. Your supply chain people should be looking at the same formula as your engineering people, for example.
Yeah.
right. One question came up here around energy costs, right? And this was really looking at, they were asking around energy costs. They said they had heard that energy costs in Poland and Czech Republic have gone up, right, because of what's going on really in the war with Ukraine, which is accurate. And then also about energy, specifically natural gas costs in Mexico, right? Because, you know, if you've got a paint line or another system like that, you also have to run that. Dave, Andy, Mark, would you, one of you like to comment on the Polish side or the Mexican side?
I can just comment in general. And it really, again, depends on your business and how much energy you typically use in your type of work. That has a big factor. I would say reliability of energy is just as important as the cost.
It is. Yeah.
Because that's a changing game too, everywhere.
Yeah, I would reiterate that, particularly in Mexico, it isn't so much it's of natural gas cost. It's where can you get natural gas? And some areas, and that's why like the Monterey Saltillo area, why it's, you have so much manufacturing there, as we all know, it's pretty good. But you get out further west, you get limited. So if you use a lot of natural gas and painting or enameling or that kind of stuff where you have to do a lot of heating and baking, it can become problematic.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing with Mexico. It depends where you are.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody knows as far as Eastern Europe with what's going on with Ukraine as to when does that settle down. But over time, I'm sure that they're going to find other sources.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when I spent a lot of time there prior to the Ukraine situation, and because of the armaments industry that was in Czech Republic and Poland, over the years, you had all kinds of opportunities if you're really in the metal business, and that obviously has changed. Where it's going to go, I mean, who knows, right? In that situation. Yeah.
So a question popped up here. A company here doesn't specify the industry sector, but they are talking about it says we're a classic industrial manufacturer, kind of heavy manufacturing. They are looking at Mexico, and I guess this question though is applied to the other sectors as well, Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. But there's a concern there about employee safety. There's a concern there around safety of management personnel in Mexico. Can you all talk about how you address those kind of issues? How you would, because everyone knows the issues there. But the question is how we address them. And I know, Mark, on our Mexico projects, it's clearly an issue that stands out every time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, again, it's really a moving target. I mean, and if you look at, if you've been doing business in Mexico for over, 20, 30 years, it's just moved around. We all remember the days of Juarez, and you had to have the armed cars to get you in and get you out and that kind of stuff. And they've improved on that. The Monterey Saltillo area has gotten better, but I think you have to look at it. You have to look at it not only regionally, almost province or county by county, depending on who, if there's bad guys there or not bad guys there. I mean, And it's, yeah, and anyway, that's been our recent, understanding.
It's
We've
a
had some-
factor to consider, definitely a factor to consider, but I agree with Mark is that, it's everywhere in the world. It's not just Mexico. Anywhere
Right.
you go, you gotta look at the safety thing, right? Even in the United States, certain places in the United States, you probably don't want to go at night, for example.
Of course, yeah.
The same thing
Yeah.
in Mexico. It really is.
Mhm.
No different.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue in Mexico, but it doesn't preclude, it shouldn't preclude anyone from going there. It's just a matter of, yeah, you're going to need 24/7 security, and you should be selective on what neighborhood you're in.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that makes a big difference.
You really have to put it on your matrix. You look at things, where do you go, labor costs, land costs. That has to be one of the items on the matrix. And to Andy's point, it should be on the matrix no matter where you go, right?
Correct.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the next question comes on around government incentives. The specific person here was they were looking to establish something in Mexico or Poland / Czech Republic. Can you all talk a little bit about the kind of incentives you would get if the kind of incentives you can expect in Mexico and the kind of incentives you get in Poland / Czech Republic? And about that, it may be someone has experience in one area, someone else has got experience in another region. But
Yeah. I guess the experience that I have is more in the Mexico area, and it's like, I'll say it's like any other place in the world. It's fairly localized, and once you identify an area, it's a negotiation. There's no
Yeah.
set formulas. It seems to be a fairly level playing field no matter where you go, and maybe depending on timing as well. I mean, they used to have tons of incentives back in China in the day too.
Right.
Kind of in places in the U.S., same thing.
Yeah.
I don't have any specifics to share.
I agree. It always seemed to me that the places where you get the best tax incentive were like places with high unemployment, places that are outside the normal logistics highway system, and
Maybe not
so
as safe.
Yeah.
maybe not as safe, without the skilled labor supply. So depending on what you're making, and the level of skill you need, you might opt to go to an area where you're not going to get as much in the way of tax incentives.
Again, let's say in my experience, it's never been a primary driver.
Yeah.
It's a nice thing to have. It wasn't the reason you went somewhere.
right.
I would just say one caveat is a little bit is what you're doing what they want, and then that can change the equation a little bit to get you in really good areas. And if you're in the space shuttle business and they want to build and wherever you're looking at, they want to build space shuttles, but otherwise if you're just trying to chase taxes, it's like tax rebates or incentives. It's kind of like chasing labor, right? And so in some cases, again, we had just some recent experience, as I mentioned, in Czech Republic, and there wasn't so much tax because that gets so political, but it was land, land incentives, and that was done regionally, in the specific town and country. The only difference I would say is in Vietnam's the same way. It's so regional. Thailand, on the other hand, does it what they call their board of investment. It's driven from the very top. And again, that's where if what you're doing is what they want, then they can be very supportive. But not everyone wants to build space shuttles, right? Yeah.
I think the point on Southeast Asia, at least like Vietnam, Thailand, they've lost in Mexico. They lost so much business to China, right, in the 90s. They've lost so much business. So now they see this as kind of a golden age a little bit. So I think it's fair to say, I know what somebody did in Vietnam, we ended up getting back about $25 million in tax incentives for a client down there. But because the government wanted them, the company was willing to relocate there. And it was a pretty large investment. But the government wanted it and sought it out. And they realized we need to get this company in there. Those two countries in particular, are so aggressive right now. because they've lost so much, and now they're viewing this is a perfect time to get back in.
Yeah.
All right, so the next question pops up here on just as far as a question that's more geopolitical. You all were talking about the risk here situation, and part of the risk. The question was, as this company's looking at it, they just wanted to ask. You all been operating in Asia for a long time. Is the concerns as far as what happens if China goes after Taiwan or China? Do you all see that as an issue going forward? This company's got 3 factories on the ground in China and is looking to diversify, but has not. And so the question really is, how serious do you think that's a geopolitical risk? And that's a very subjective question, but obviously they're asking, this is an issue that they're bringing up with their board and the senior management.
You know, there's always personal opinions. I'm gonna keep mine out of it, but regardless, the reason it's simply talking about it, you should have contingency plans at a minimum.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you can say, well, you know, if that happens, you got World War III, all bets are off. It's like, well, yeah, but you really should have a contingency plan in place. You know, war game it as it's called.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of companies do it. And this is no different than any of the other things we do.
I think it goes right back to that risk mitigation and having a backup plan. Is that, you know, I don't believe anybody, I mean, long term, it's pretty clear where Xi wants to go. And at least to this point, it's pretty clear, you know, what the US plans to do about it. And that would create a huge supply chain problem, make Ukraine seem minor in comparison. So
I guess the advice for anybody who's asking the question, because I'm actually looking at a series of reports I have on my desk, there is a wealth of knowledge on all that kind of stuff. Our own government publishes a lot. The CIA website's a great place to go. The State Department. We talk about different countries and what's happening in the world. So if you're thinking you want to have a plan, you should actually verse yourself in that stuff, at least to stay on top of it.
So the follow-up question was, they got 3 factories in China that need to get out. Their question was, based on what they've heard today, a lot of the comments you all made, the key things to be looking at is certainly not the labor, but it's the raw material availability, it's the operational capabilities, and the closest to your customer base. Is that a pretty fair summary of what they laid out?
right, and whether or not you're wanting to sell into China, because if you want to sell in China, trying to move it out of China and then export from somewhere else into China, you're gonna struggle.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the guys that are in China for China. Yeah. Right.
Completely agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, this company mentioned they've got a local office, a sourcing office in China, and they mentioned that they are talking to other companies and they're end up closing these local offices. Because the whole idea was they set them up probably 10, 15 years ago, sourcing out of China. It's not nearly as competitive as it used to be, so now they're closing their sourcing offices, moving those Southeast Asia, Mexico, elsewhere.
Well,
That's going to be very dependent on this individual situation. I mean,
yeah.
one thing to remember, even if you are moving your sources out of China, going to other sources, you know, the second tier suppliers may all be in China, and you may want you want to mitigate risk. You may need people on the ground in China still for continuity to help with that. So just one thing to think about. But I think it's going to be very dependent on the specifics of a individual company's operation.
Right, and then
just because the company supply chain partner and you think they're not going to have any influence over that, have your eyes wide open.
right.
And you broke up there. Can you say that again?
There's a lot of Chinese companies operating outside of China for supply chain, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there's no influence from China to those companies outside.
Right.
So it's just another factor in your risk mitigation
right.
thoughts.
And I would say too, because what everyone said is China's not going away, and whether it's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, $100 billion of investment over the last 25 years. If you do decide to leave China, you need to do it correctly, because you may not, because if you ever want to get back in there again or do things there, you don't want to be on anyone's blacklist, have done anything incorrectly, because you may still need them, even though it may be not exactly what, how you think you're going to do it. Yeah.
Look, we've got some more questions that popped in, but it's 12 o'clock. So for those questions we did not get to, you'll be hearing back from us in the next 3 business days. I want to very much thank Dave Burdick, Andy Barnicus, and Mark Plum for participating in this. Andy and Dave, thank you all very much for taking the time to share your season, your vast experience of this. It was really helpful. So I appreciate you all taking the time to do this. As again, this East-West webinar on the China Challenger, and the next webinar will be held at the end of November, and that will be on Mexico. For right now, we'll call this webinar. And again, Andy, Dave, thank you all very much for taking the time to do this.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Alex.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.